Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you making the trip and all of you making the trip. So I'm going to do an introduction of everybody on the stage and try to do a very brief summary of their book, just in case you haven't read it. Hopefully you've read them. So all the way on the end, we have Jenny Offel. She's the author of 3 novels, including Last Things, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and a finalist for the Los Angeles Times First Fiction Award. Her novel, Department of Speculation, was shortlisted for the Folio Prize, the PEN/Faulkner Award, and the International Dublin Literary Award. Her novel, Weather, was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction and longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. Jenny lives in New York State and teaches at Bard College. Her novel, Weather, is told in fragments. The narrator is Lizzie. She is a librarian, and she has a lot of anxiety about climate change, about the presidential election of 2016, and questioning love and relationships and just her place in the world. And she also works for a podcaster, answering letters that are mostly kind of doomsday-esque. Next to her, we have Taya Aubret. She's the internationally best-selling author of The Tiger's Wife, which won the 2011 Orange Prize for Fiction and was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her second novel, Inland, was an instant bestseller and won the Southwest Book Award and was a finalist for the Dylan Thomas Prize. She was a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree and was named by The New Yorker as one of the 20 best American fiction writers under 40. Her new novel, The Morningside, comes out on March 19th. Taya lives in Wyoming. And The Morningside tells the tale. It's kind of a not apocalyptic per se, but the sea levels have risen, and there's a city called the Island City that's maybe New York that's partially underwater, and there's refugees. The main character is an 11-year-old girl named Sylvia, and she and her mom come to the Island City from a foreign land as refugees, and there's some kind of apocalyptic things going on. There's like a program with rations. There's kind of a program to bring people over to live in the worst parts of the country, and it's kind of about her story in this building. And also there's a lot of folk tales and some magical thinking involved. Next to her is Pam Zhang. She's the best-selling author of How Much of These Hills is Gold, which was the winner of the Academy of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Award and the Asian Pacific Award for Literature, longlisted for the Booker Prize, and a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award and the National Book Critics John Leonard Prize. Her new novel is Land of Milk and Honey, which is longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize. Pam lives in New York. Land of Milk and Honey takes place in a world where climate change, there's smog all over the world. It's hard to find air to breathe, and her unnamed narrator moves to become a chef in this private enclave where the wealthy people have been able to buy their own country next to Italy, where they still have sun and can grow food, and they're doing a lot of experiments on food and bringing extinct species back to life and sort of living a more sensual, gluttonous life when everybody else is basically eating like mung bean flour. And then we have Lily Brooks Dalton. She's the author of the national bestseller, The Light Pirate, which was the runner-up for the Dayton Literary Prize, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and a Good Morning America Book Club selection. Her novel, Good Morning Midnight, was the inspiration for George Clooney's film adaptation, The Midnight Sky. Her memoir, Motorcycles I've Loved, was longlisted for the Oregon Book Award. Lily lives in Los Angeles. And her book, The Light Pirate, also takes place in a world where hurricanes have taken over and in Florida. And her main protagonist is Wanda, and she is born on the day of a very massive hurricane called Wanda, and she grows up in a world that's covered by water, where government has broken down. People have been paid to leave Miami, but not in other smaller towns in Southwest Florida, so they're trying to make it on their own, and it follows Wanda through her whole life, and she happens to have a little bit of a magical power. When she goes underwater, she can spread light and repair some species. Hopefully I gave a good summary of all your books. Just in case you probably have never met me before, I'm Mitzi Rapkin, founder and producer of First Draft, a dialogue on writing. It's a literary podcast that focuses on literary craft, the themes of a writer's book, and the writing life. Each episode is an interrogation into the mind of one writer at a time and inevitably focuses on what it means to be human. For nearly 11 years, I've read a book a week to produce 52 episodes a year. There are more than 450 episodes in the archive with today's best contemporary writers of fiction, nonfiction, essays, and poetry. So thanks for that. I hope to not talk that much the whole rest of the time. But I wanted to start out with, we're at a climate festival to talk about ideas and science. And I think this is the first time in the history of this 3 years festival where we've talked about fiction and books about climate change. And I think fiction is really important in our world. But I wanted to start off and ask all of you, why fiction? What does fiction bring you? Why is fiction important?
Well, Missy, do you mean why fiction in terms of addressing climate change, or why fiction in general? Why is it? Okay. I think that storytelling is kind of one of the main, perhaps the main avenue that human beings use to make sense of the human condition, to make sense of who we are and what we're capable of and what's come before us and what can come after. I mean, even just the way we go about making sense of a singular experience in a singular day, it becomes a story that we tell to someone else. And so that's all that fiction is made of. To me, it's just this really integral part of how we live.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone else.
I think there's I totally agree with what you said. Daily life and human life, the life of the species, is chaotic, and we have a tendency, I think, and a real impulse to try to make order out of that chaos. And fiction, one of the reasons I write fiction, and I think one of the reasons I read fiction too, is that it gives this sense of orchestration and meaning that pulls us out of that sense of chaos, even if it's not real, and kind of especially if it's not real.
Pam and Jenny, do you want to add anything?
I think for me, whenever I'm writing a novel, it's always in some way sort of a snapshot for me of how it feels to be alive in a particular moment in time, and what sort of currents I'm feeling, what feels like important things that are swirling around that I'm affected by. And I think in terms of writing about climate, one of the things I was interested in is how can fiction sort of serve as a place to rehearse disaster? How can it be a site where we can think speculatively about community or about repair? My novel is actually a pre-apocalyptic novel in a way, because I was interested in, I feel like we hear a lot about climate change deniers, but I think there's a lot more people who know about the climate crisis, not sure what to do, and often feel perhaps overwhelmed by the other elements of their life that involve caretaking and expanding that to a larger group of other humans and other species. Felt like an interesting thing to think about on the page.
I've been teaching a generative novel writing class for the past 8 months, in which students come not with a polished manuscript, but with an idea that they want to explore. And I realized that the sort of pedagogical cudgel I keep wielding over them is every time you find something that you're afraid of in your manuscript, go deeper into it, chase that fear. So I feel like this is a maybe perhaps slightly more extreme version of what Jenny just said, which I agree with. Is that I think that to be alive right now in this moment is often to be paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, and the vast amount of options and the vast amount of catastrophic outcomes that might arise after this moment that we're living in. And the power of the novel is often to explore the ugliest, the most scary, the weirdest, and by reading about those outcomes to sort of take away some of those fangs from those outcomes, right? And just to be able to look at them from all angles, from all approaches. I'm very much a fan of the amoral character and, characters that might be called villains, because I think those are ways in which we explore the extremes of our own impulses.
Yeah. So yeah, taking it to that next level, and Jenny, you sort of started that, is incorporating the climate into your fiction, whether it's in the background or part of your story. Many of you have spoken to, it's the moment that we're having, it's the things that think about, it's how what it means to be alive today. Is you can't ignore like the biggest problem we face as a species. So I'm curious about taking that on in fiction, and fiction cannot be, I would say, you can disagree, didactic. It has to tell a story, it has to explore something, but it's not going to be filled with data and science. You have to bring life to it. So I wanted to ask you about choosing to have climate in your novels and also making it story worthy, how you maybe blended research with what you said, how you made sure that you were still capturing the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously the logistics are important and fascinating, and the facts and the politics and the the minutia of it. But I'm, as a fiction writer, so interested in the feelings that come along with it, and so fiction is such a perfect avenue to be exploring. The feelings that my characters are experiencing, but also the feelings that I am experiencing, and that perhaps you are also, which is an enormous amount of dread and anxiety and doom. And, as so many other people were saying, as Pam was saying, it's kind of the defining emotional cocktail of our time. And how do we live with that? Like, what do we do with that? And so for me, kind of playing out some of those scenarios in a story is how I'm both coping with it and trying to imagine another way of coping with it. It's both a portrait of how I see people coping with it and trying to imagine something else.
I tend to, when I first have an idea for a book, it starts really from an emotion, and for the emotion was dread with this one. And I was thinking about, why is it that you can intellectually know the details of the climate crisis, but at the time that I was beginning the book, which was maybe 2015 or 2016, I could tell that I didn't emotionally feel it. And I wanted to explore that and pick a character that wasn't, I felt like there had been a lot of novels at the time, there's been many since, but the nonfiction writers were doing an amazing job of kind of explaining the mechanisms of what was going on, explaining some of the consequences. But I wanted someone that didn't actually hit the tab on the environment page in The Guardian, and didn't look at that, but was also someone that was concerned about the state of the world. And so what I did was I read a lot of the science of climate change, and then I sort of read outwards. And eventually I ended up reading this book by a sociologist named Stanley Cohen, which was called States of Denial, Looking Away from Atrocity. And one of the things that he talked about was this concept of twilight knowing, that there's often a state where, and in his case, he was talking about it in the lead up to the Holocaust. He was talking about it in terms of apartheid, where people know on some level the terrible things that are taking place and that they are complicit with by their silence, but they also are afraid to know more, are afraid to look directly at it. And for me, I was interested in creating a character who started slowly to look. directly at it, and what was that like, and what did it feel like? I know for me, it felt like, oh, now I'm going to ruin every dinner party I ever go to, which I did for a while. But for this character, I felt like also I wanted to explore, what do we do when your financial or emotional life is already pretty precarious? How do we still engage with these things that involve the collective and the larger community?
It's so interesting that you're mentioning this, this idea of ruining dinner parties with this information, and the battle between the feeling and the knowing, which I think is actually coming up a lot here. But there's also the issue of climate fiction itself and the way it's been positioned, right? Like for a long time, anything dealing with climate, I think, fell into the notion of apocalypse fiction. And apocalypse fiction, for a long time, was sort of sidelined as science fiction, right? And that's niche. And like the minute it sort of began to edge into a more mainstream concern, as it has become more and more relevant, or publicly relevant, or in our own lives, then it became sort of this well, that's political fiction, right? Like that's spinach. Now I don't want to read this book because it's going to beat me over the head with facts and it's going to make me feel bad for eating the beef empanada downstairs, right? Like that's the but the place that I wanted to start from, or something that I've been thinking about for a long time that made its way into this book, which is about a climate refugee, was the notion of apocalypse as it is presented in Western narratives. We have a tendency, I think, to consider apocalyptic events as world-ending, sort of broadly world-ending, whereas the truth is apocalyptic events are taking place all the time, all over the world, climate-related and not. They're happening right now as we sit here in several places on this earth. And there is a tendency to think of apocalyptic outcomes as something that happens elsewhere. And I was born in Yugoslavia right before the war. So I come from one of those places where apocalyptic events happen, right? And it was a society ender. The war that dissolved Yugoslavia was terminal to its society. And there's a real fear, I think, of this like one event, whereas the reality of it is that those kinds of events are happening all the time, and climate change makes it feel like they're edging closer and closer. And I wanted to explore the life of a character who had been through an event like that and fled to a place where it was also coming, and where it was undergirding everything. The inevitability of it, which I think people find so paralyzing, is the thing. And society kind of moves around that inevitability.
Yeah. And not only that, so many climate events are happening all over the world right now, but they have been happening for decades, if not centuries. It's interesting, right? I'm thinking a lot about this idea of labels and what you were saying about climate fiction being a genre today, which it was not 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. Like when this most recent book of mine came out, the New York Times like literally labeled it climate fiction. I was like, oh, that's interesting, because that's not what I go into it necessarily writing. I think that what motivates me then when I go to the page is not falling into a genre, not disseminating a series of fact, but I think what has unified my two novels is this idea of home. How do you find a home on this earth, in a culture, in a society, and also physically? My first novel, How Much of These Hills Is Gold, was a Western. It took place in, the 1800s. It follows the Chinese American fiction, but I would argue that that is as much a book about, if not climate change, at least the age of the Anthropocene. There's a lot in the book about mining, about digging, about what human Western white human society is doing to the land as it moves westward in the United States. And I think that one of the ways to take to kind of grapple with my fear of a potential apocalypse is one, as Taya said, to not think of it as like one giant apocalypse, but as many, many things that are happening and have been happening. And also to just take some comfort in the fact that people have dealt with these ruptures, physical, societal. You know, my parents grew up and experienced the Cultural Revolution in China, right? These things have happened, and this sort of underpinning human desire to find a home on this earth is, you know, a question that I think is relevant to more and more people, especially in developed Western societies today. But it is also a question that so many people have, millions, billions of people have grappled with and found some kind of answer to.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, what a lot of you are alluding to is, you know, our human potential to take in the world, to take in dread, to take in fear, to take in change, and how we also grapple with that anxiety and what we think maybe is permanent might not be. And that is the nature of being alive today. And I pulled out some quotes. I'm hoping we'll get to everything, but we'll just see how the conversation goes. But I want to start with one from Lily. It's towards the end of her book, and she's talking about the main character, Wanda, as she's aged. And you say, she trusts that this place will go on changing long after she is gone. The elderly die, and the old ways die with them. The young are born, and fresh traditions begin. One of the children here sees through the darkest nights as if it were day. Another can hold her breath underwater for a long, long time. Another has learned to hear the fish chattering beneath the waves. They do not call these gifts magic, and they do not call them science. They call them what they are, change. So I just wanted to ask about change and writing this. Like, I have tears in my eyes. If you want to say anything about that line, but it also seems to go with some of the things that you're all talking about.
Yeah. Change. Yeah. I mean, it's such a, you know, integral idea, right? It's part of everything. There's a great Octavia Butler line about change that I'm going to remember wrong. But I think it's changes everything, or changes in everything. You know, I think that part of what we're all up here talking about today in terms of these feelings around climate and telling these stories around climate and the sort of negative changes that are unfolding all around us and how we're coping with that. For me, in order to spin a narrative out of that that doesn't make everyone want to just like hide under the bed for the rest of their lives, is to find a thread of hope to cut that with, right? To figure out how to bring in just enough brightness to create a feeling of levity without kind of over padding the honesty of it. Because the truth is important also, which is that this is all very scary and very real, and outcome does not look great. You know, but I think within that truth, what I see is this idea that, you know, collectively we have created an enormous disaster. What else can we do collectively? Like, we have such a powerful presence as a species on this planet. We've wielded it in a really terrible way, and yet it's a powerful presence. So like, if we are able to kind of turn that, what else could we achieve here? I don't know if that's a good answer to that.
Yeah, I am curious too about the role of hope in writing your books. If you feel any sort of obligation to have hope in your books, if it's a reflection of something inside of you. I know, Jenny, you have a website for hope on yours, so curious about the role of hope in the narrative and in your process.
Well, my website has, it's called Obligatory Note of Hope, because one of the things that I noticed in all the environmental things I was reading is that they would lay out very soberly all the things that were happening and all the terrible things. And at the end, there would almost be this like forced uplift where it would be like, but if every single person in the whole world gets together and does everything at the same time, we all just like, then we'd all be fine. We just had to do it next year. And I have a friend who works for the Center for Biological Diversity, and she's also a novelist, and I was talking to her about it, and she's like, oh yeah, the obligatory note of hope. Like, I actually have to get off and write one of those right now. And, but I was also, as I was, you know, I'm not good at saying what my novel is about in a couple lines, but briefly I was telling people it's about a librarian who becomes a climate change doomer. And then I realized actually that wasn't really true to the arc of the book, because I know that I went through a really dark sort of doomer period writing it, but by the middle of it, I came out at the end much less that way. And I think what that was, first of all, I realized it was a little bit of a, it was a response that was fatalistic and nihilistic, and was in that way just as bad as denying that this was going on at all. And so I began to think about, like, well, what kind of hope feels like real hope? And the other part of the website I have is called Tips for Trying Times, and I've taken things that I found in various biographies and things that I read, like, what did people do during the siege of Leningrad? You know, what did people do at these, and these kind of amazing moments of what people chose to do in these times. And it just kept reminding me of the fact that we can't live in these silos of dread. And I ended up sort of, by the end of it, realizing we as a culture, especially as an American culture, you know, we're used to those voiceovers about the next movie, and it's all like one man, you know, with one thing, like changes the world and saves everyone. And I think that has been really reductive as a way to think about the climate crisis. What I see is so many people, so many organizations picking an area that aligns with their interests and talents and doing some meaningful work there. So for me, that's hope, but it's really more meaning. Like, I was just reading in the New York Times today about the microforest that they're going to put in New York City. I don't know if anyone read that, where they're going to taking a spot, and in terms of helping against the sea level waters, it's going to have native plants, and the roots are going to go down, and it brings in more insects and birds. And those are the sort of things that give me that sense of, this is not dread. This is about looking straight at it and thinking, okay, where's my part? And, you know, my part was weirdly writing a novel, which I used to leave my study and say to my husband after a few hours, like, well, I'm glad I'm writing this experimental novel that's going to end climate change. But we all have little roles that we play.
Do you want to say anything about hope, or you don't have to?
Oh, I thought I did just say things.
No. Tia or Pam.
What did I say?
I feel like it's hard to follow what Jenny said. I feel more hopeful just having heard that, you know. But it is true. This notion of it's interesting that you're talking about the sort of the individual as savior, right? Like this kind of vaguely propagandistic narrative that's like if one good person can do it, the rest of us don't have to do a thing. We can just sort of sit there and wait for this one individual. But we are our society has been shaped to favor the individual. And hope is in the collective, right? Like it actually is, and it always has been. That's how we started, and that's where we have to be going in this collective effort, perhaps aimed at small individual things, right? Like small individual pockets of change.
Yeah, I respond very much to this idea that hope cannot be individualistic, and I maybe want to put forth another word, which is faith. I think a great degree of my personal dread about our climate crisis is that I've been a control freak all my life, right? And the idea that like one person, one institution, one president, one country cannot give me, you know, like the bullet point list of how everything is going to unfold in the next 20 years and what are all the policies, and it's unpredictable, right? We live in an age of great unpredictability. And so what I can do is I can do my little toil and just try to have faith that the other people around me are doing their parts. And there's this kind of, in writing my second novel, I was forced to embrace a kind of ambiguity about the future that I had to make peace with. I think, of course, we all must work as a human species to try to undo or slow down some of the things that we're wrecking upon this planet. And at the same time, a lot of what gives me hope is knowing that the planet is much older and wiser than we are, and that it has incredible powers that we're not aware of. And we should also try to think about that, right? One really important thing that I read up upon while writing my novel that didn't go directly into it, but perhaps more into the emotional core of it, was the story of bringing wolves back into Yellowstone. Okay, I see everyone nodding here. I think we're all probably familiar with. I'll try to summarize it very briefly. But effectively, wolves were killed in Yellowstone at some point because humans thought of them as pests, and then researchers wanted to reintroduce the species. And they're like, great, we're going to reintroduce the wolves. Maybe they'll have some impact on, I think it's the deer or the deer who elk, right, who also live in the park. But what ended up happening was this sort of waterfall of environmental consequences that no human scientists, however long they had studied these topics, could have foreseen, right? Like the elk also impacted the growth, I believe, of like grasses and young trees, which also impacted the beaver populations, which in turn impacted water flow, so that suddenly there were these streams and rivers that the researchers thought had gone dry, that had sprung back into life. And that's the other kind of faith that I want to hold on to as well.
Yeah, and I think underlying this discussion, and I hope every event that you go to this weekend is, it makes me tear up. It's like a profound sense of love for this planet. Just like so deep. Sorry, it just like moves me so much. And you wrote, Pam, to me that wine was fig and plum, volcanic soil, wheat fields, shading to saltstone, sun, leather, well-baked, and finally, most lingering, strawberry. It is easy all these years later to dismiss that country's purpose as decadent and gluttonous, selfish. It was those things, but it was also this connoisseurship of loss. And I love that line, the connoisseurship of loss, because the people they're like hoarding these beautiful things, these flavors, this sensuous life that we've had on this planet, and we've been lucky to still really be experiencing, even in the midst of all this. And just wanted to talk to you about love and loss and folding that into your book, and also like, how do we, I don't know if you had a seminal moment where you connected with nature and were like, aha, but just talking about the love also.
Yeah, thank you. Love, and I also think grief. I think a big part of facing this fear we have is allowing ourselves to grieve for what has been irreparably lost. Right? I think we need to also acknowledge that while there are things we can do and things we should do and futures to consider, we have lost many species, many environments, many facets of this world, and some of them are not coming back. And I think it's very, in my view, un-American to talk about loss in this way, especially publicly. It, for whatever reason, I think in an American climate, it feels like you're losing. if you've like, I don't know, there's something about it that I can't really put my finger on, right? But I think that kind of grief is so important. It's often the first step. It's that first step of acceptance before we can be like, and now that we've mourned those things, what are the other things that we might have? What are the other things that we might preserve? And I really, really believe that that emotion is crucial.
Yeah. Okay. And people can add something on whenever they want to about any of these topics. Just for, the idea of that grief continuing. Taya, you wrote, this is also towards the end of the book, and it's a mother to a daughter. And I realized that I'd brought you into a life at a time when everyone else's debts had come due. Only the debtors weren't around anymore to pay up. If you told me when I was a young girl sitting under an umbrella in the town square, she'll have none of this, your kid. She won't know a year that was safer or calmer than the one before it. She won't live in a time where she can expect anything. Nothing will be useful to her. I would never have believed you. So it really is getting to this loss and change and grief. And maybe yet she still has to go on.
And I think, just to sort of bridge that with what Pam was saying, grief implies death, and death is something that we as a society and maybe even as a species are very bad at coping with and talking about publicly and contending with. Everything in and around us strives for life, and the way it has come to be translated in our culture is sameness, predictability, and stability, right? Like this idea that if I, that our parents perhaps were able to say, okay, I went to school, I got a job, I lived my life, I have my family, and I am now in sort of the twilight years of my life, and this is the template of existence that I can reasonably expect from my offspring, and that's just not the case anymore, right? Like and not just in economic terms, but in terms of social values, in terms of safety, security, all these things that we want to that we have been told are the things we're supposed to pass on to our offspring, are no longer valid. And I think that the book and sort of the way that I interpret hope for myself is this idea of resilience and adaptability, right? Like that's how we got here as a species, adaptability, the ability to roll with the punches. And I think, society has tried and failed to say there will be no more punches if you live in the West, if you live within a society that has a certain socioeconomic standing, and that hasn't been true of the rest of the world, and it just isn't true of existence. You see human resilience everywhere, and it's heartbreaking to face it, because it does feel like a death that these old ways no longer exist. But new ways are how we move forward.
There's a line in my novel towards the end, which is something that I found in a book about these monks that live on an island, and very few people have come there over the years, and they have an area where they keep the bones of all the monks that have lived there over the years, and one was asked, like, what is your philosophy, and he said, we have died, and we are in love with everything. And that's what I feel like in this moment in time. Like, I no longer feel that certain ideas I had maybe of what could be stopped or repaired may or may not come to pass. but I do feel like every major religion in the world, every mystical tradition teaches us, well, what's here? What are you in love with now? And so for me, that's something to counter the dread, and something to also expand your awareness, because I have a Colombian friend, and I was at a environmental thing with him, and he said, you know, the way that people here are talking about collapse is the way that the person who grows your coffee lives already. So let's think about, instead of this idea that we've always had in the West, that progress is something that we want, that there is such a thing as progress continuing on and on and on. That's actually not how nature works. Nature, things will die, other things will come in their place, some things will regenerate, some things will not. But I think, you know, the end of the world as we know it is, as Paul Kingsnorth said, it's not the end of the world, full stop. And I think just being interested, curious really, about, well, what is this world? What is this world we're in if we're not still grasping for the one that was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
I was taking a walk about a week and a half ago, the very end of February, I think, with a friend in Brooklyn and her 2.5-year-old son, and there were magnolia trees blooming, and we freaked out, right? We're like, oh my God, this isn't supposed to happen. It's the apocalypse right now, like blah, blah, blah. We were terrified. And her son like toddles over and looks at the magnolia tree, and all he thought was that was pretty. And there's something in that, right? And like, as again, like while we should and can mourn, I think there is a way to be curious, as you said, Jenny, and as you've said too, Taya, about what the shape of a new world looks like and how we might try to observe it with the eyes of a child who hasn't known any different, or perhaps the eyes of another species, or just accept what it is and find some kind of beauty in that too. Because the other thing that I'm also aware of watching how politics have unfolded in the last decade or so, right, is the potential danger of weaponizing too much nostalgia, right? I think grief is very different from nostalgia. Grief actually allows you to put a stop to nostalgia and say, like, we had that, we mourn it, but we accept that there is something else coming. Whereas nostalgia can be this dangerous calcification where people become so brittle in their desire to hold on to, well, this is what I had, or this is what my parents had, that they can no longer look at the world correctly. And that is a thread in my book, where these wealthy people are the ones who are trying to just recreate the world just for themselves and hold on to it so hard that they can't see past it.
I'm so glad that we're talking so much about grief on this panel. I feel like there's not a ton of room for this conversation in other events that I do and just like in my daily life. I think we're really quite bad at giving grief space in our culture, and this rush to fill that space with solutions and hope and all of these other very important things, I think really does a disservice to this like natural process that we're talking about. You know, in my experience, like my heart feels terminally broken. And I think that the only way for a broken heart to heal is to be witnessed. And so if we're not taking that time to be witnessing our own grief and each other's, I don't really see how this process can unfold of moving through it, you know, not that it's, you know, there's an end point, but I think this conversation is so important, and I'm relieved that grief is taking up perhaps even more space than hope on this panel.
We have time for questions. I don't know if there's mics, but I can repeat it. If you have a question, oh, there are mics. So there's a microphone person.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your work. thinking about being a creative in this new emerging space of climate fiction, climate storytelling, when you were still in the creation and pitching of your works, how were you able to take that to the people that held that power of like, we can publish your work, or we can create the story that you're looking to write? Like, what was your pitching process like, and how did you kind of sell that story because you knew it was important, but how did you make other people realize it was important too?
Well, I do my best not to pitch anything because I'm bad at it, and because, because I don't want to hear like a no or a note about something that doesn't exist yet. So this is like certainly not always possible and a great privilege, but I do my very best to create the thing and then say, here it is, do you want it? And if not, then we are not aligned, and move on from there.
But the thing exists, right?
The thing exists, and this is what I made, and either we agree that this is worth it or no. And I'd, if possible, not always possible, I'd rather take that risk than ask permission to make something.
And, you know, I think at least books are a very, they're a slow technology. And I know that when I, you know, told my agent that that this book, part of it was going to be about climate, she wasn't thrilled. Because I think she thought, again, this is years ago, she thought, well, first of all, that's not what you write. And second of all, who wants to read that? It's so dark and dreary. And what I realized was the same thing that you're saying, Lily. I just decided to shut up about it and write it because one of the things I was interested in too, which is it's sort of a small concern, but I was thinking in so many other professions that are really difficult, like if you've ever known people who are EMTs or emergency room doctors, they have a really dark sense of humor. And it's one of the things that gets them through. And I was like, where's the humor, like in this dark situation? I wanted to write, you know, a funny, at least that was the attempt, to have some funniness with the darkness. And so I just decided to be quiet and write it. And what I think you never know is that I remember I was almost done, and that article appeared on the front of the New York Magazine called "The Uninhabitable Earth." And all these people that I'd been ruining dinner parties with for years started calling and texting me and saying, that thing that you told me, I just read that. Is that true? Is that really true? And so sometimes things sort of, you know, you don't know. I think it's always very, I never think you should try to write for the zeitgeist or the whatever. I think you should just write for what is in your heart and on your mind, and then when you're done with it, what I tell my students is, you know, there's the church, there's the temple and the marketplace. Write in the temple, and then after it's done, you can go to the marketplace. But don't think of them beforehand, because I feel like they have different values, and you have to keep some to yourself in order to kind of have the strength to make it.
Another question?
I'm actually just going to add one other small thing to that while the microphone is making its way over. I think that, you know, wow, it just went fully formed out of my head.
It'll come back. It'll come back. It's just recycling.
Do the question.
Okay.
Sure. Hi, I'm a satirist who wrote a book called Miami Creation Myth, and what I'd love to hear from the panel is, what role do you think humor and satire could play when writing about such a potentially dark topic, such as climate change?
I mean, I can talk about it if you like. I just think that it's a way, humor is a release from dread. And I think that satire can also help us to kind of see the contours of something that's happening in our society that maybe if it isn't written in that particularly sharp way, we might miss. I mean, I went through a period when I was writing weather where I felt like I was always places where some tech bro guy was telling me about how they were gonna bring back woolly mammoths, and like, and I felt sort of like I think I need to write about that, and so I ended up writing about how these and the singularity and longing for that, and I just remember writing like, these people long for immortality, but they can't like wait 5 minutes for a cup of coffee, because we would be somewhere and they'd be like, that kind of thing. And so I feel sort of like whenever you see those contradictions, whenever you see those moments of hypocrisy, which I feel like we all have. I mean, I briefly tried to get a little campaign going called Activism for Hypocrites. It didn't catch on, but that was the only way I could see myself as an activist, So I really think I just think we need everything. We need every tool. We need everything that people can bring. So if you're funny, if you're a satirist, like bring that. If you're someone who knows about how to do sustainable farming, do that. And I feel sort of like there's nothing that won't add to the conversation, and the more interdisciplinary the conversation becomes, the better.
I remember what I was going to say.
Great. Knew it would.
Far more articulate than what I said.
But back to the question about pitching, I think the thing that I hear from people the most when I talk about this book is I don't like this kind of fiction. I don't like post-apocalyptic fiction, but for some reason I picked up your book and I liked it. And so I think that kind of reinforces my plan to never pitch this kind of thing and to just write it and let the work speak for itself, because I think part of my job is convincing you to like it and like finding a way in that you didn't see coming, which sounds sneaky, and maybe it is, but it works.
So the Trojan horse
sneaky.
of
Yes.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks for this wonderful discussion. It's been really eye-opening and kind of, but what I've noticed a little bit of, I guess, dissonance between the tone of the conversation here and the way that climate change is talked about in other rooms at this, other rooms I've been in, but even other rooms at this, at this conference here. And I was really struck by what you said about that urge, which I've been thinking about a lot, of sort of like injecting, like we need to have this narrative of hope. We need to have this sort of like positive spin, even despite all we've lost and almost, barely a passing glance at everything that's gone wrong. I wonder, I guess, I sort of see literature as the refuge for genuine individual human experience, where a lot of other forms or a lot of other kinds of communication are intent on sort of broadcasting something for some other purpose. And I wonder, I guess, how you deal with, or if you feel that you're fighting an uphill battle against sort of like an enforced narrative of hope that is not always valid, or against sort of various other more compromised ways of talking about or communicating around climate change, and the experience that people are having today and looking to the future.
I don't see it as a battle. I'm very glad you pointed out some of those dissonances, because I hear them, but I guess like I challenge the idea that it is a battle, or that there can only be one dominant narrative of climate change. As Jenny was sort of saying about humor, I think applies to me more broadly across the entire spectrum, is we need all kinds of narratives. We need the didactic policy press releases. We need the nonfiction articles. We need the memoirs, and we need the fiction and the memes. Memes are like something that gets me through a lot of my moments of climate grief. Like we need all of that. And the reason I want to challenge the idea of dissonance as competition. One narrative is something that I think I hear a lot in these spaces. I was really struck at last night's, evening plenary, I think it's called, right, when I believe Al Roker spoke about renewable energy in the U.S. and renewable energy in China, and asked, how does the U.S. become dominant in renewable energy? And it's like, on the one hand, I understand why you have that kind of conversation from a business perspective, but to sort of this like Chinese idea of activism for hypocrites, I was like, wow, isn't that funny? I thought we were literally talking about saving our one planet together. And here we are yet again talking about capitalism and dominance and who's going to get the most money, which again, I understand those conversations move a lot of needles. So I'm not saying don't have them, but just, there is that dissonance. You see it, we see it, and it's part of life.
I do think though that there is, I really agree with what Pam's saying about that. There's a need for not thinking of it in these kind of battle metaphors. I think, though, that there is a way in which, I remember the other day I was like describing a conversation I'd had with someone who was an environmentalist, and I said, well, it's the kind of person, they're kind of like a hope scold. Like anytime you say anything that isn't like hopeful enough, they'll be like, well, we can't give up now. And I'll be sort of like, I'm not giving up, I'm just expressing like the range of emotion that I feel. I mean, that I feel when my daughter, who goes to school in Vermont, says there hasn't been any snow. I love snow, and thinking, is that, what if she does have a child? Is there going to be no snow? Whatever the little thing is that you have at the moment that you're thinking about that feels like a loss, I feel like it's pretty hard. I mean, if you've ever had a loss in your own life, you're aware how people don't know what to say, and how people will say crazy things. They'll say, oh, well, well, my cat's sick, and you're sort of like, well, my friend had a daughter who died, and everyone just said all these things that were, but it was so uncomfortable to stay in that space and to just witness someone's fear and grief. And I think, writers are kind of good at that, because we just go. I always say it's like you're wearing like a little minor light, and you're like lowered down into a dark well, and then you're supposed to just like write about what's down there. So I think that it just like it probably behooves me to think in more practical terms and more outside of just intellectual things and more action-oriented. I think it might be useful for people that are used to be in that kind of space to just allow for someone expressing fear, doubt, dread, resignation, all these things, and not feel like you have to gin them up, because it's a long, long walk that we're all doing together. And I think that we have to give each other grace to sort of be in whatever spot we're in. And so so the temptation is there to be like, you must be hopeful. But I kind of take refuge in this idea that is from Albert Camus. In The Plague, the doctor there who's fighting the plague, he says that he doesn't believe in hope, but he believes in active fatalism. And that is fumbling in the dark, trying to do what is right, not knowing if it will succeed or not. And that's sort of at least where I am, like active fatalism. I have no idea. None of us predicted the pandemic, which was horrible, but gave me a few moments of thinking, I don't know if I'm going to think about climate change this month, because no planes are flying. We don't know what's going to come around the corner, and I think it's hubris for us to think we know. But for me, that's helpful to just kind of think about, what if I don't rush into this space and try to make it better?
Any other questions? Oh, there's one way over there. The microphone is coming.
So you all are just fabulous at writing about the emotions of sort of the creeping loss. But one of the things that's amazed me is how you all come up with your ideas of sort of showing in the external world physically how that loss is happening. For example, and the light keepers, the crumbling infrastructure of the electric grid. I'm curious just sort of how you all think of examples in terms of your story to sort of convey climate change.
For me, someone in my family is a lineman. So that is sort of where my imagination started in terms of unpacking, listening to him complain about how totally degraded and in places unfixable the electrical grid in this country is, really kind of set me on this path of like, what is the future here if the workforce that is trained to fix this grid is diminishing, people are aging out and new linemen or line people are not being trained at the rate that they're needed, some of the disasters that we're all picturing seem really obvious, but some of them seem a little bit less accessible. And so I was really curious to kind of do some research and get into something that I hadn't thought of before he started talking about it as like a really big problem. And as I was writing, the power outages in Houston happened, and I was like, wow, okay, well, that's another example of what this looks like down the road. So I think for me, like in a fiction space, finding something a little bit unexpected to unpack in like a futuristic space was just exciting for me in terms of research and in terms of the narrative possibilities.
I lived in Manhattan for many years, for 8 years, and about 3 years before the pandemic, I lived on a street called Seminary Row, and the Jewish seminary was at the end of the block down the hill, and they sold a parcel. I think it was their library and their parking lot to a developer. And so for 3 years, we watched and listened to this developer break down this historic building and replace it with a 32-story luxury tower that sort of stood in the middle of Upper Manhattan. It was the tallest building anywhere in sight, and as a neighborhood, as a community, we loathed it with all our hearts. And it was completed as a sort of ironic gift in March of 2020. And those lofts went on sale in like May of 2020, and the studios were something like $2 million. I mean, like it was ridiculous. It was a very beautiful but very ridiculous building, and it reminded everything about it, having witnessed having witnessed the demolition of its predecessor and then its construction, and the sort of ironic ending to all that set me on the path to writing this book, The Morningside, because there was something so stubbornly hopeful about the whole, like stubbornly and violently hopeful about what this developer was doing. And then the nature of life all around it, making impossible this human project, was so fitting. And so extraordinary. And I thought of all the places around the world that are abandoned, right? Like we're a boom and bust species in so many ways, right? It's like, well, this is working. We're going to plow all our stuff into it over here. And like, oh, the resources run out. Like we're going elsewhere, and that moment, this, seeing this building being like, well, this is now practically abandoned. Like it sits relatively empty. What would it be like in 100 years? This building was built on ludicrous hope. So that's what set me on the path.
So we have 0 minutes left, sadly.
Sorry.
But I just want to say a few words. First of all, thank you so much to everyone for sharing your hearts and your craft and what you write about and your hope and your grief. It means a lot. And then I just want to say thank you to all of you. Remember that Taya's book is coming out on Tuesday. Tomorrow, Aspen Words will announce the shortlist for the Aspen Literary Prize, and we hope to see Pam on there. Next Monday, Taya's episode goes live on my podcast, and mid-April, the episode with Lily will be broadcast. I have 2 in the archives with Jenny. I have bookmarks for my podcast if you'd like one, and thank you so much for being here and fighting for the Eden that we call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitzi.